Imagine standing in your kitchen on a Friday afternoon. The sun is out. The weather is warm. Your children are at school. You are cleaning the house, getting ready for the weekend. And for just a moment, everything in the world feels exactly the way it should. Now imagine that in the next 3 seconds, without any warning at all, your floor splits open and fire comes pouring up from beneath your feet. Your walls catch. Your curtains catch. Your clothing catches. And by the time you understand what is happening, your home, your street, your entire neighborhood is gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone. Erased from the earth as though it never existed. That is not a scene from a movie. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened on October 20th, 1944, in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, on a quiet street lined with small homes and hard-working families who had done absolutely nothing wrong except live in the wrong place at the wrong time. On that Friday afternoon, at exactly 48 seconds past 2:40 in the afternoon, the ground beneath the working-class neighborhood on Cleveland's east side opened up and swallowed everything. Manhole covers launched into the sky like mortar rounds. Jets of fire erupted from storm drains, from gutters, from cracks in the pavement. A wall of flame traveling through the underground sewer system ripped through 20 city blocks in a matter of minutes, and the temperatures at the center of the blast reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt steel. That is hot enough to vaporize a human body so completely that nothing remains. Not bone, not teeth. Not a single trace that a person ever existed. When it was over, more than 130 people were dead. 61 of them were burned so badly they could never be identified. 21 of those victims were never claimed at all, because there was simply nothing left of them to claim. 79 homes were reduced to ash. 2 entire factories vanished. More than 200 cars were melted into the asphalt beneath them. And an area covering nearly 1 full square mile of an American city looked as though a bomb had been dropped directly on top of it. And here is the part that makes this story almost impossible to believe. Scientists later calculated that the force of this explosion was equal to roughly 1/6 the power of the atomic bomb that the United States would drop on Hiroshima less than 1 year later. 1/6 of Hiroshima. Not in a war zone, not on a battlefield. In a residential neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, where families were eating lunch and children were sitting in school just a few blocks away. The flames shot 2,500 feet into the air. People could see the fireballs from 7 miles away. Birds were incinerated in mid-flight, and the bells of a neighborhood church began to ring on their own, shaken loose by the force of the shock wave that rattled windows in towns miles from the blast zone. This was one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. It was the largest liquefied natural gas explosion of the entire 20th century. Time magazine called it one of the major catastrophes of the modern industrial era. And yet, if you asked 100 Americans to name it, almost none of them could. Almost nobody outside of Cleveland has ever heard of it. Almost nobody knows what happened on that street, on that day, to those people. And the reason nobody knows is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire story. Because this was not a random accident. This was not an act of God. This was the result of a decision. A specific, deliberate decision made by a company that knew its equipment was untested, that knew the technology was experimental, and that chose to move forward anyway because there was a war on, and there was money to be made, and there were factories that needed fuel. The danger was not hidden in some remote location miles from civilization. It was sitting right there, in plain view, at the end of a residential street, less than 200 yards from people's front doors. 4 massive gas storage tanks, towering over the rooftops of family homes, filled with millions of gallons of liquefied natural gas, cooled to 250 degrees below zero. The neighbors looked at those tanks every single day. They worried about them. They asked questions, and every single time, the company told them the same thing. There is nothing to worry about. The tanks are perfectly safe. The technology is sound. Trust us." And so they trusted them. And on a perfect Friday afternoon in October of 1944, the trust killed 130 people and erased an entire neighborhood from the face of the earth. This is the story of the East Ohio gas explosion. It is the story of a neighborhood built by immigrants who came to America with nothing and spent decades building everything they had with their own hands. It is the story of a company that cut corners during wartime, used materials that had never been tested, and placed the largest experimental fuel tank in the country directly next to the homes of families who had no idea what was sitting beside them. And it is the story of how all of it, every piece of it, was quietly buried, pushed below the fold by wartime headlines, smoothed over by settlement checks, and slowly, deliberately forgotten. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, before we get into the full story, there are a few things you need to understand about what you are about to hear, because this is not a simple story with a simple explanation. When this explosion happened, the United States was in the middle of World War II. American soldiers were fighting and dying overseas. And when the blast hit Cleveland that afternoon, many of the people who witnessed it genuinely believed that the Germans had launched an attack on American soil. They believed that enemy bombers had somehow reached the heartland and dropped explosives on their neighborhood. That is how massive the destruction was. That is how unthinkable it seemed that something like this could happen from within, from a facility that the community had been told was completely safe. But this was not the work of enemy bombers. This was the work of a single storage tank that should never have been built the way it was built, in a location where it never should have been placed, using materials that had never been properly tested. And the deeper you go into this story, the more questions start piling up. Questions that, 80 years later, still do not have satisfying answers. Why did the East Ohio Gas Company build a massive experimental fuel tank using substitute materials that had never been tested at extreme temperatures? And why did they place it directly next to a densely populated residential neighborhood, when that tank showed clear warning signs of failure in the months before the explosion, including visible frost forming on its outer shell where no frost should have appeared? Why did the company respond by blowing hot steam onto the tank walls, instead of shutting it down and investigating the problem? And after 130 people were killed, and an entire community was destroyed, why was no one ever held criminally responsible? Why did 9 separate investigations fail to produce a single definitive finding? And why did one of the worst disasters in American history simply fade from public memory, as if it had never happened at all? To answer those questions, we need to go back to the very beginning, not to the day of the explosion, but to the years before it, to a neighborhood on Cleveland's east side that was built by people who had come to this country with nothing, who had survived poverty and depression and war, and who had slowly, carefully, over the course of decades, built a life for themselves and their families in the shadow of something they could not control. If you had walked through the St. Clair Norwood neighborhood on Cleveland's east side in the early 1940s, you would have found a place that felt like a small village inside a big city. The streets were narrow and tree-lined. The houses were modest, mostly wood-framed, built close together in tight rows that faced the sidewalk. Laundry hung on clotheslines in the backyards. Kids played stickball in the alleys. And on any given Saturday night, you could hear the sound of polka music drifting out of the social halls along St. Clair Avenue, where families gathered to eat and drink and dance, in a community where everyone knew your name and your parents' names, and your grandparents' names too. This was the heart of the largest Slovenian community in the United States. The families who lived here had come to America from a small country wedged between Austria and Italy, a place most Americans in the 1940s could not have found on a map. They came in the early 1900s with almost nothing, following the promise of factory work and a chance to build something better than what they had left behind. And Cleveland delivered on that promise, at least in part. The wire factories, the steel mills, the stamping plants, the foundries that lined the lakefront along Lake Erie. They all needed labor, and the Slovenian immigrants who settled along St. Clair Avenue were willing to do the hard, dangerous, back-breaking work that kept those factories running. Generation by generation, family by family, they built a neighborhood from scratch. By the 1940s, the St. Clair Norwood neighborhood was a thriving, self-sustaining community. There were grocery stores and bakeries, hardware stores and shoe repair shops, saloons and taverns, where men gathered after their shifts to talk about the Cleveland Rams or argue about the war. There were funeral homes and furniture stores, drug stores and barber shops. There was a bowling alley. There were at least 3 churches, and at the center of it all stood St. Vitus Church, the spiritual anchor of the Slovenian community, a place where weddings and baptisms and funerals marked the rhythms of neighborhood life in the way they had for decades. Let us call one of the families who lived in this neighborhood the Novak family. Tom Novak was a foreman at one of the stamping factories along the lakefront. He had worked there for 15 years, 6 days a week, saving every dollar he could. His wife, Mary, ran the household with the quiet, fierce efficiency of a woman who had grown up during the Depression and had learned the hard way that nothing in this world was guaranteed. They had 2 children, a boy of 12 named Eddie who was in 7th grade, and a girl of 9 named Anna, who spent most of her free time reading books on the front stoop. The Novaks were not rich. Nobody in this neighborhood was rich. But they had a home. They had each other. They had a life that they had earned through years of honest, grinding work. And they had a tin box in the bedroom closet. That tin box is important, because inside it Mary Novak kept the family's entire savings, cash, bonds, stock certificates, everything the family had accumulated over 15 years of factory wages and careful budgeting. She did not keep it in a bank. She had tried that once during the 1920s, and when the Depression hit and the banks failed, she lost everything. She swore she would never trust a bank again. And she was not alone. All through the St. Clair Norwood neighborhood, house after house, families kept their life savings at home, in tin boxes and coffee cans, and dresser drawers and envelopes taped to the back of closet shelves. It was the immigrant's insurance policy. The world fell apart again. At least your money would be right where you could reach it. But there was one thing in this neighborhood that Mary Novak could not control. One thing she could not tuck away into a closet and protect. And it sat at the end of her street, visible from her kitchen window every single morning when she poured her first cup of coffee. 4 enormous gas storage tanks, rising above the rooftops like steel mountains, owned and operated by the East Ohio Gas Company. 3 of them were spherical, giant silver globes, roughly 63 feet in diameter, gleaming in the sun. The 4th was different. It was cylindrical, 57 feet tall, the newest and the largest of the 4, and it had been built just 2 years earlier, in 1942. It looked like a massive steel barrel standing on end, and there was something about it that made people uneasy, even if they could not explain exactly why. The neighbors talked about those tanks. They talked about them at church and at the grocery store and over the fence in their backyards. They wondered what would happen if one of them ever failed. They worried. They asked questions. And every time they raised a concern, the East Ohio Gas Company gave them the same answer. The tanks are perfectly safe. The technology has been tested. There is nothing to worry about. We know what we are doing. One local priest who grew up in the neighborhood would later recall that the gas company always said it could never happen, that the tanks were completely safe. And the people believed them because what choice did they have? The gas company was a major employer in the area. It powered the factories that gave the neighborhood its jobs. It heated the homes that sheltered their families. You did not pick a fight with the company that kept the lights on. You trusted them. You had to. But here is what the families in that neighborhood did not know, what they could not have known, because nobody told them. The East Ohio Gas Company was not storing ordinary natural gas in those tanks. It was storing liquefied natural gas, a substance that most Americans in 1944 had never heard of. LNG is natural gas that has been cooled to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature so extreme that the gas turns into a liquid and shrinks to roughly 1/600th of its original volume. That meant you could store an enormous amount of energy in a relatively small space. It was revolutionary technology. It was also almost completely untested. When East Ohio Gas built its first 3 tanks in 1941, the facility was only the second of its kind in the entire country. The science was new, the engineering was experimental, and the long-term risks were largely unknown. For the first 3 years, everything seemed fine. The 3 spherical tanks operated without incident, quietly doing their job, storing gas and releasing it back into the system during peak demand periods in the cold winter months. The company was pleased with the results. The technology worked, and then demand began to surge, because by 1942 and 1943, the war had turned Cleveland into one of the most productive industrial cities in America. The city was the 5th largest hub for war-related manufacturing in the nation. Factories were churning out tanks and planes and ammunition around the clock, and all of that production required energy. Gas consumption was skyrocketing. East Ohio Gas needed more storage capacity, and they needed it fast. So they made a decision. They would build a 4th tank, a bigger tank, a tank that could hold the equivalent of 100 million cubic feet of natural gas, nearly double the capacity of each of the 3 existing spheres. But here is where the story takes its turn. Because in 1942, the United States was deep into World War II, and one of the consequences of that war was that strategic materials were rationed. Steel, the metal you would normally use to build a storage vessel designed to contain liquid at 260 degrees below zero, was being shipped overseas by the thousands of tons to build ships and tanks and weapons. The high-grade nickel-steel alloy that had been used to construct the inner walls of the first 3 tanks, a material specifically chosen because it could withstand extreme cold without becoming brittle, was not available in sufficient quantities. The tank designer, a company called Pittsburgh Des Moines, recommended a different approach. Instead of building another sphere using the proven materials and design, they proposed a larger cylindrical tank using a lower concentration of nickel in the steel alloy and a different type of insulation. The first 3 tanks had used cork between their inner and outer shells, a material that provided consistent, even thermal protection. Tank number 4 would use rock wool instead, a cheaper and more readily available substitute that did not distribute cold temperatures as evenly across the tank's surface. In other words, they changed the shape, they changed the material, and they changed the insulation all at the same time on the largest and most critical tank in the entire facility. And none of these changes were thoroughly tested before the tank went into service. Tank number 4 was completed and began operating in 1943. Almost immediately, there were problems. When the tank was first filled with liquefied natural gas, the inner steel wall cracked due to uneven cooling. The rock wool insulation was not distributing the extreme cold evenly across the tank surface, creating hot spots and cold spots that put uneven stress on the metal. The company repaired the cracks and put the tank back into service. In the months that followed, workers noticed something else. Frost was forming on the outside of the tank in patches, something that should not have been happening if the insulation was working properly. Frost on the exterior meant that the extreme cold from the liquid inside was bleeding through the insulation in certain spots, reaching the outer shell. This was a warning sign. It meant the insulation was failing. It meant the inner steel wall was being subjected to uneven temperatures that could weaken the metal over time. The company's response to this problem was to blow hot steam onto the frosted areas of the tank's exterior. They were treating the symptom rather than the cause. Every time they blasted hot steam onto a section of the tank that had been chilled to extreme cold, they were creating exactly the kind of rapid temperature cycling that causes metal fatigue and embrittlement. They were, in effect, making the problem worse with every attempt to fix it, and they continued doing this from March of 1944 through October of 1944. For 7 months, right up until the day the tank failed. Nobody shut the tank down. Nobody ordered a full inspection. Nobody questioned whether the substitute materials were performing as intended. The factories needed gas. The war effort needed fuel, and the tank was still standing, still holding, still doing its job. Or so it appeared. Because inside the walls of tank number 4, in places no one could see, the metal was changing. The alloy was becoming brittle. Microfractures were spreading along the seams. The steel was slowly, invisibly failing, like a bone weakened by disease, still bearing weight but ready to snap at the slightest shift. October 20th, 1944, was one of those perfect autumn days that make you forget about everything else. The sky over Cleveland was clear and blue. The temperature was unseasonably warm, the kind of Indian summer afternoon that felt like a gift. The war news was cautiously optimistic. American troops had just landed in the Philippines. People talked about it on the streetcars and over lunch counters and on factory floors across the city. There was a sense, maybe for the first time in years, that things might be turning a corner. At the Novak house on East 61st Street, Tom had gone to work that morning the same way he always did. Eddie and Anna were at school. Mary was home, tidying up the kitchen, planning to run to the grocery store later that afternoon to pick up a few things for the weekend. The tin box in the bedroom closet held everything the family had. The gas tanks at the end of the street sat where they always sat, massive and silent, their steel surfaces gleaming dully in the autumn sun. Nobody knew it. Nobody could have known it. But the clock had already started, and the neighborhood had less than an hour left. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon on October 20th, 1944, the tanks at the East Ohio Gas Company's No. 2 Works plant had been filled to capacity in preparation for the coming winter season. Workers moved through the facility on their normal rounds, checking gauges, recording data, and approving routine maintenance logs. It was a Friday. The week was almost over. Some of the men were already thinking about what they would do that evening, where they would go, who they would see. In the neighborhood just south of the plant, the afternoon was moving at its own unhurried pace. Women were in their homes, many of them cleaning in preparation for the weekend and the coming Sabbath. A few men who had finished early shifts were already home, settling into living room chairs, reading the newspaper or listening to the radio. The streets were quiet. The schools were still in session. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, something changed. On the side of tank number 4, the massive cylindrical vessel that had been showing warning signs for months, a seam in the steel wall gave way. The metal that had been slowly weakening from months of temperature cycling and embrittlement finally reached its breaking point. And when it broke, it did not crack slowly. It ruptured. A stream of liquefied natural gas, cooled to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, began pouring out of the side of the tank. As soon as the supercooled liquid hit the warm October air, it began to boil and vaporize, expanding rapidly into a dense white fog that rolled outward from the base of the tank like a wave. People in the surrounding area noticed it almost immediately. Workers at nearby factories saw a strange white haze collecting at the base of the tanks. Residents on the closest street saw what looked like a low cloud forming at ground level, creeping along the pavement and curbs. Some of them smelled something odd. Others simply noticed the fog and wondered where it had come from on such a clear day. Nobody ran. Nobody panicked. Nobody fully understood what they were looking at, because liquefied natural gas was still so new, so unfamiliar, that most people in that neighborhood had never been told what it looked like when it escaped into the open air. They did not know that what they were seeing was an invisible countdown. The fog did what any gas heavier than air will do when it reaches street level. It flowed downhill. It followed the path of least resistance, moving along the curbs and gutters, pooling in low spots, creeping toward the nearest openings it could find. And the nearest openings were the storm drains, the catch basins, the grated openings in the curbs that connected the surface of the street to the vast underground network of sewer pipes that ran beneath the entire neighborhood. Within minutes of the leak beginning, Liquefied natural gas was pouring into the sewer system beneath 20 city blocks. It vaporized as it moved, mixing with air and with the methane gases already present in the sewers, creating an explosive mixture that filled the underground tunnels, like fuel being pumped into the barrel of a cannon. Every manhole, every drain, every basement connection, every crack in the underground infrastructure became a potential detonation point. The entire neighborhood was sitting on top of a bomb, and the fuse was already lit. At exactly 48 seconds past 2:40 in the afternoon, something provided a spark. Nobody knows what it was. Nobody will ever know. The people closest to the ignition point were killed instantly, and every piece of physical evidence was obliterated in the blast. It could have been a pilot light in a basement furnace. It could have been a spark from a piece of industrial machinery. It could have been a car engine backfiring on a nearby street. But whatever it was enough. The explosion was instantaneous. It was massive, and it was unlike anything anyone in Cleveland had ever experienced. The detonation ripped through the underground sewer system with the speed and force of a military weapon. Manhole covers, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, launched into the sky as though fired from cannons. One manhole cover was later found several miles away in the Glenville neighborhood, on the far east side of the city. The pavement buckled and split open in jagged lines across entire streets. Jets of fire erupted from every storm drain, every gutter opening, every crack in the road surface. The flames shot upward from below, turning the streets themselves into channels of fire. Above ground, the initial blast sent a fireball climbing 2,500 feet into the air. People in towns 7 miles away could see the flames. The shock wave shattered windows more than a mile from the blast center. The walls of buildings shook. Doors blew open, and in the tower of St. Vitus Church, the bells began to ring on their own, set swinging by the force of the explosion that passed through the earth and the air simultaneously. In the homes closest to the tank farm, the destruction was absolute. Survivors who lived just outside the immediate blast zone would later describe what they experienced, and their accounts are almost identical. They said that within a split second their homes and their clothing were on fire at the same time. There was no warning, no gradual build, no chance to react. One moment they were standing in their kitchens or their living rooms, and the next moment everything around them was burning. The fire came from below, up through the basement drains, up through the floor itself, and it moved so fast that many people were engulfed before they could reach a door or a window. The air temperature in the blast zone reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, structural steel melts at approximately 2,700 degrees. The blast zone was hotter than the melting point of the steel that was supposed to contain the gas in the first place. At that temperature, human tissue does not simply burn, it vaporizes. The county coroner, a man named Dr. Samuel Gerber, would later tell reporters that the heat had the power to vaporize human flesh and bone, making an exact count of the dead impossible. Some of the victims were not found because there was nothing left to find. The destruction radiated outward from the tank farm in every direction, but it did not follow a logical pattern. Because the fire traveled primarily through the sewer system, it erupted in places that seemed random. One house would be completely consumed while the house next door was barely touched. A row of homes on one side of a street would be reduced to ash, while the buildings across the road stood intact. The fire followed the pipes, the drains, the underground infrastructure, and wherever the gas had accumulated in higher concentrations, the explosions were more severe. It was as though the neighborhood itself had been booby-trapped from below. At the Novak house, Mary was in the kitchen when the blast hit. She felt the floor shudder beneath her feet, and in the time it took her to turn toward the window, she saw a wall of orange light rising from the direction of the tank farm. She did not have time to process what she was seeing before the second wave hit. The underground wave, the one that came through the sewer pipes and up through the basement drain. The house shook violently. She heard glass breaking and wood cracking and a sound like a freight train roaring through a tunnel directly beneath the floor. She grabbed her coat and ran for the front door. When she reached the porch, the street was on fire. Not just the buildings, the street itself. Flames were shooting out of the storm drains on both sides of the road, and the asphalt was buckling under the heat. Cars that had been parked along the curb were already burning, their tires melted flat, their paint blistering and peeling, and everywhere, there were people running. Some of them were on fire. The initial blast was devastating, but what happened next made the disaster exponentially worse, because it introduced the cruelest element of all: false hope. After the first explosion, firefighters from Engine Company Number 19, stationed just a quarter-mile away, responded immediately. Their captain, a man we will call Captain Jim Rankin, was sitting in the front room of the station house when the windows rattled and the building began to shake. He ran outside and was hit by a blast of superheated air that nearly knocked him off his feet. Looking toward the tank farm, he could see flames rising above the rooftops and hundreds of people running toward him, streaming away from the fire in every direction. He called in the alarm and mobilized his men. Within minutes, fire engines from across the city began converging on the east side. The initial response was aggressive and organized. Firefighters moved into the blast zone, laying hose lines across intersections, working to contain the fire and protect the surrounding structures. And for a brief period, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, it appeared that the situation might be manageable. The fire seemed to be concentrated around the tank farm itself. The immediate danger seemed contained. Spectators who had fled the initial blast began drifting back toward their homes, believing that the worst was over, that the fire department had things under control. This was a catastrophic mistake, because at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 20 minutes after the first explosion, tank number 3 exploded. The second blast was enormous. It leveled what remained of the tank farm and sent a fresh wall of fire racing outward through the neighborhood in every direction. People who had returned to their homes were now trapped. The fire spread through 20 blocks simultaneously, leaping from house to house, racing through the sewer lines to ignite structures that had been untouched just minutes earlier. The pattern of destruction became even more chaotic and unpredictable. Homes that had survived the first blast were consumed by the second. Streets that had been passable moments earlier were now rivers of fire. The explosion also destroyed the neighborhood's water infrastructure. Water mains ruptured from the force of the underground blasts. Fire hydrants went dry. The firefighters who had been making progress suddenly found themselves fighting an uncontrollable inferno with no water supply. They were forced to fall back, pulling their hose lines and their men out of the fire zone, retreating block by block as the flames advanced. Eventually, the United States Coast Guard deployed a fireboat on Lake Erie and ran 1,500 feet of hose from the lake into the neighborhood, pumping water directly from the lake in a desperate attempt to stop the fire from spreading to the nearby chemical manufacturing plants along the waterfront. If those plants had gone up, the disaster would have been many times worse. For hours after the second explosion, smaller blasts continued to rip through the neighborhood. Manhole covers kept blowing into the air. Pavement kept splitting open. Underground electrical conduits exploded. Gas lines that had nothing to do with the tank farm ruptured from the force of the sewer explosions, feeding even more fuel into the fire. The entire underground infrastructure of the neighborhood had become a chain reaction, one explosion triggering the next in a sequence that no one could predict or control. Firefighters worked through the night battling the flames block by block, house by house, in conditions that veterans of the department would later describe as the most dangerous and heartbreaking they had ever faced. By the time darkness fell, the full scope of the catastrophe was becoming visible. Flames lit the sky in an orange glow that could be seen from miles away. The smoke was thick and black and carried the smell of burning gas and burning wood and something else, something that the first responders recognized but did not want to name. The military was called in. The Ohio State Guard, the Coast Guard, Navy personnel from the Great Lakes Training Station, and the city's entire Civilian Defense Corps, a volunteer force that had been organized in case of a wartime attack on American soil. were all deployed to the east side. The irony was inescapable. The people of Cleveland had spent years preparing for the possibility that an enemy might attack their city from the air, and when the attack finally came, it came from below. It came from the ground they walked on. It came from the sewers beneath their feet, and it came from a company that had promised them they were safe. At the schools near the blast zone, teachers kept their students inside and under control. This single decision almost certainly saved dozens of young lives. If the explosion had occurred just 90 minutes later, after the schools had let out, children would have been walking home through the streets that were about to become channels of fire. They would have been playing in the yards and alleys that were about to be consumed. The death toll would have been staggering. As it was, most of the children survived, but many of them came home that afternoon to find that their homes were gone. Some of them came home to find that their mothers were gone. Eddie and Anna Novak were among the lucky ones. They were still at school when the blast hit. Their mother, Mary, had managed to get out of the house and run south, away from the fire, joining the stream of hundreds of people who fled the neighborhood on foot, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But the tin box in the bedroom closet, the one that held everything the family had saved over 15 years of hard work, was gone, burned to nothing. By late the next afternoon, Saturday, much of the fire had burned itself out. Electricity was gradually restored to some areas of the east side. The military maintained a strict perimeter around the blast zone, and police issued orders that no residents, no property owners, and no civilians of any kind were to be allowed back into the affected area until further notice. No property and no bodies were to be removed, except under the direct supervision of the Cleveland police or fire departments. The neighborhood that had been alive with music and conversation and the sounds of children playing just 24 hours earlier was now silent. What remained looked like a war zone. Block after block of charred foundations and collapsed walls, and blackened chimneys standing alone where houses had once been. Twisted metal, melted glass, ash everywhere, thick and gray and clinging to everything, and scattered among the rubble, the things that survived by chance. A brick from a fireplace here, a cast iron stove there, a set of ceramic dishes, somehow unbroken, sitting in the middle of what had once been a kitchen floor, and in the ruins of one house on East 61st Street. Search crews would eventually find something that would become one of the most haunting details of the entire disaster. A wedding dress, untouched. Not a single scorch mark on it, sitting at the base of a chimney that was the only thing left standing of a home that had been completely destroyed. The owner's mother had kept it there, and somehow, impossibly, the dress had survived when nothing else had. It would be kept for decades afterward, a relic of a life that the fire tried to erase but could not completely destroy. When the search teams finally entered the blast zone in the days that followed, they encountered something that even the most experienced among them were not prepared for. The destruction was total. In the area closest to the tank farm, there was simply nothing left. No structures, no vehicles, no recognizable features of any kind. The landscape had been reduced to a flat, charred expanse of rubble and ash that bore no resemblance to the neighborhood that had stood there 48 hours earlier. But it was what the search teams found, or more precisely what they could not find, that made this disaster unlike anything in Cleveland's history. The county coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, was one of the first officials to survey the aftermath. He was an experienced man, accustomed to the realities of death and destruction. But what he saw in the days following the explosion shook him in ways he would later struggle to articulate. The temperatures at the center of the blast had been so extreme, so far beyond anything that the human body can withstand, that many of the victims had not simply been burned. They had been erased. The fire had the power to reduce a human body to a fine ash so completely that nothing identifiable remained. No bones, no dental work, no personal effects, no fingerprints, nothing that could be tested, measured, or matched to a name. Dr. Gerber initially estimated the death toll at 200. He made this estimate based on the number of people known to have been in the affected area at the time of the explosion. minus the number of survivors who had been accounted for. But he acknowledged publicly and on the record that the true number might never be known. The heat had been so intense that it was possible, even likely, that some victims had been completely vaporized, leaving no physical evidence of their existence. In the days following the blast, as search crews worked through the rubble with shovels and rakes in their bare hands, the official death toll was gradually revised downward, not because fewer people had died, but because fewer remains could be found and counted. The final official count settled at 130 dead, but of those 130, 61 were so severely burned and disfigured that they could not be identified through any available method. No dental records, no personal belongings, no recognizable features, and of those 61, 21 were never identified at all. Not then, not in the weeks that followed, not ever. 21 human beings who had been alive and present in that neighborhood on a Friday afternoon simply ceased to exist in any verifiable, documentable way. Their families could not claim them because there was no way to prove who they were. Nearly a month after the explosion on November 14, 1944, a mass funeral was held at Highland Park Cemetery on the far east side of Cleveland. 61 of the victims, 53 of them unidentified, were buried together in a large circular grave. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish clergy stood side by side and conducted the service together, because this was a neighborhood that had been home to people of all faiths, and the dead belonged to everyone. Approximately 2,000 people attended the funeral. They came from all over the city, from all walks of life, united in grief for neighbors and strangers alike. For the unidentified dead, there were no individual caskets, no personal eulogies, no family members to speak their names. They were laid to rest together in a shared grave, beneath a simple memorial marker that stands there to this day. For the survivors, the nightmare did not end with the funeral. In many ways, the aftermath was worse than the disaster itself, because it forced people to confront not just what they had lost, but how completely and how permanently they had lost it. The physical destruction of the neighborhood was devastating enough. 79 homes completely destroyed, 35 more partially destroyed, 2 factories gone, more than 200 cars and trucks reduced to burned-out shells, over 700 people left homeless. The Red Cross established an emergency shelter at Wilson Junior High School on East 55th Street, where approximately 680 people, entire families with nothing left, crowded into the gymnasium and the hallways and the classrooms, sleeping on cots, eating donated food, waiting for news about when they might be allowed back into the neighborhood to see what remained of their lives. But the financial destruction was even more cruel, because this was a neighborhood of immigrants, a neighborhood of people who had lived through the Depression, a neighborhood where the memory of bank failures was still fresh and raw and deeply personal. When the banks collapsed in the 1930s, families in this community lost their savings. They swore they would never trust a bank again, and so they kept their money at home. Cash in envelopes, bonds in dresser drawers, stock certificates in filing cabinets, savings accumulated over decades of factory wages and careful, penny-by-penny budgeting, stored in tin boxes and coffee cans and secret hiding places throughout their homes. And on October 20th, 1944, all of it burned. The federal government had a policy regarding damaged currency. It would replace paper bills that were at least 3/5 intact. Anything less than that was subject to review by the Treasury Department, a process that was slow, uncertain, and often fruitless. For families whose homes had been incinerated at 3,000 degrees, there was nothing to submit. Their savings were not damaged. They were gone, destroyed so completely that not even ash remained. People wept over tin boxes that held only charred fragments of what had once been their life's work. 15 years of wages, 20 years of careful saving, a lifetime of sacrifice. All of it reduced to a handful of black flakes that crumbled at the touch. Total property damage from the explosion was estimated between $7 million and $15 million in 1944 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that figure would be well over $100 million today. But the numbers do not capture what was really lost. What was lost was security. What was lost was the feeling that you had built something that could not be taken away. What was lost was the belief that if you worked hard enough and saved carefully enough and played by the rules, your family would be all right. That belief burned along with everything else on October 20th, 1944. In the days and weeks following the disaster, the city of Cleveland launched an investigation. Mayor Frank Lausche appointed a special board of inquiry to determine the cause of the explosion and to assign responsibility. The board was given broad authority to examine evidence, interview witnesses, and compel testimony from company officials and employees. In parallel, multiple federal agencies launched their own investigations, including the Bureau of Mines, which conducted a detailed technical analysis of the tank failure and the sequence of events that followed. In total, there would be 9 separate investigations into the East Ohio gas explosion. The findings were damning in their implications, but frustratingly inconclusive in their specifics. Investigators established with reasonable certainty that the disaster began with the failure of tank number 4. The cylindrical tank, built in 1942 using substitute materials due to wartime shortages, had ruptured along a seam in its inner wall, releasing its entire contents into the surrounding area. The cause of the rupture was determined to be low-temperature embrittlement, a process by which certain metal alloys become brittle and prone to fracture when subjected to extreme cold over extended periods of time. The steel used in tank number 4, with its lower nickel content, was simply not adequate for the temperatures required for LNG storage. The metal had been slowly weakening for 2 years, and on October 20th, it finally gave way. Investigators also noted that the rock wool insulation used in tank number 4, as opposed to the cork insulation used in the first 3 tanks, had failed to provide consistent thermal protection. This uneven insulation led to temperature variations across the tank's surface, which accelerated the embrittlement process and created stress points that weakened the seams. The frosting that had been observed on the exterior of the tank in the months before the explosion was a clear warning sign that the insulation was failing, and the company's decision to treat the problem by blowing hot steam onto the tank walls had almost certainly made the situation worse by introducing rapid temperature cycling that further stressed the already weakened metal. But when it came to determining the specific trigger, the exact moment and mechanism of ignition, the investigations ran into a wall that they could not get past. The explosion had destroyed the evidence. The area immediately surrounding tank number 4 had been completely obliterated. The workers who had been monitoring the tanks at the time of the rupture, the people who might have been able to describe what they saw in those final minutes, were among the dead. 73 of the 130 victims were East Ohio Gas Company employees. The men who knew the most about what happened that afternoon were the first to die. Mayor Lausche's Board of Inquiry ultimately issued its final report in 1945. The conclusion was stated in careful bureaucratic language that said everything and nothing at the same time. The board found that the disaster was caused by, and this is a direct summary of their finding, some deficiency or failure due to causes unknown in design, construction, or operation of the unique process. Causes unknown. That was the official answer. After months of investigation, after thousands of hours of testimony and analysis, the best that 9 separate investigations could produce was that something had gone wrong, but nobody could say exactly what or who was responsible. Nobody was criminally prosecuted. No executive was charged. No engineer was held personally liable. East Ohio Gas Company moved quickly to manage the financial fallout. The company paid out more than $3 million in settlements to neighborhood residents and an additional $500,000 to the families of the 55 company workers who lost their lives. These payments were made voluntarily, without any court order or legal finding of fault, in a process that was efficient and relatively quiet. The company also publicly emphasized that the destroyed plant had held only 24 hours' worth of gas for the city, a statement that seemed designed to reassure the public that the remaining gas infrastructure was not a continuing threat. but the larger questions, the questions about accountability and responsibility, and the decisions that had led to 130 deaths, were never fully answered. No one explained why an untested tank design was placed directly next to a residential neighborhood. No one explained why the warning signs of tank failure were ignored for months. No one explained why a company that was storing one of the most volatile substances on Earth within 200 yards of family homes had no emergency plan, no containment system, no way to prevent a leak from reaching the surrounding streets and sewers. The investigations produced findings, the company wrote checks, and the matter was closed. For months after the explosion, the blast zone sat empty. Winter came, and snow fell on the ruins, covering the charred foundations and the blackened earth in a blanket of white that made the devastation look strangely peaceful from a distance. But up close, nothing stirred. No construction crews, no repair work, no signs of life. The neighborhood that had housed hundreds of families was a wasteland, and there was no plan in place to bring it back. Hundreds of displaced residents were still living in temporary shelters, in the homes of relatives and friends, in church basements and community halls across the east side. They had no homes to return to. Many of them had no money, no savings, no insurance payouts, nothing except the clothes on their backs and the hope that somehow, someday, the neighborhood they had built over decades might come back to life. But hope was in short supply in the winter of 1944, and the people of St. Clair Norwood needed something more than hope. They needed someone to take the lead. That someone was a man named Anton Grdina. He was a Slovenian immigrant who had arrived in Cleveland in 1897 with almost nothing and had built himself into one of the most successful and respected businessmen on St. Clair Avenue. He owned a hardware store, a furniture store, a funeral home, and a bowling alley. He had helped establish 2 banks for the Slovenian community. His personal motto was, "Everything from the cradle to the grave," and he meant it literally. If you were born in that neighborhood, there was a good chance Grdina's furniture store had supplied your crib. If you died there, his funeral home handled the arrangements. He was not a politician. He was not a public figure in the way that mayors and congressmen were. But in the Slovenian community on Cleveland's east side, Anton Grdina was the closest thing to a civic institution that the neighborhood had. After the explosion, Grdina did what the government and the gas company had not done. He organized. He formed the St. Clair Norwood Rehabilitation Corporation, donated $5,000 of his own money to get it started, and began rallying the community to rebuild. It was not fast. It was not easy. It required convincing displaced families that it was worth coming back, that the neighborhood could be what it had been before, that the future was not lost. It required persuading banks to lend money for construction. It required coordinating with the city on permits and zoning and infrastructure repairs. It required, above all, the kind of stubborn, relentless immigrant determination that had built the neighborhood in the first place. And slowly, lot by lot, house by house, block by block, the neighborhood came back. New brick homes went up along East 61st Street, replacing the wooden houses that had burned. The streets were repaved. The sewer system was rebuilt. The utilities were restored. Within a decade after the explosion, the neighborhood had been almost entirely rebuilt. Many of the same families returned. They moved into their new homes, hung curtains in the windows, planted gardens in the backyards, and got on with the business of living. The spot where the gas tanks had once stood was turned into a park, named Grdina Park, in honor of the man who had led the rebuilding effort. A memorial marker was placed there, a modest stone marker that tells the story of what happened on October 20th, 1944, in plain, simple language. If you visit that park today, you will find a quiet neighborhood of brick homes and tidy lawns. Children play on the playground equipment. People walk their dogs along the sidewalks. Nothing about the place suggests that it was once the site of one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. And that brings us to the question that has haunted this story for 80 years. Why does nobody know about this? 130 people were killed. An entire neighborhood was destroyed. The explosion was 1/6 the force of Hiroshima. Time magazine listed it as a major catastrophe. 9 separate investigations were conducted, and yet, outside of Cleveland, this disaster is virtually unknown. It is not taught in most American history courses. It does not appear in most textbooks. It is not referenced in most discussions of industrial safety or corporate accountability. It is, by any objective measure, one of the most forgotten disasters in American history. Part of the answer is timing. October 20th, 1944, was the same day that American forces under General Douglas MacArthur landed in the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise to return. That story dominated every front page in the country. The war was the story. Everything else, no matter how devastating, was secondary. The Cleveland explosion was reported, but it was pushed below the fold, buried beneath headlines about the Pacific Theater and the march toward victory. Within days, the news cycle had moved on. But there is another answer, a harder and more uncomfortable one. The victims of the East Ohio gas explosion were largely working-class immigrants. They were Slovenian families, people who spoke accented English, who worked in factories, who did not have political connections or media influence, or the kind of social standing that commands attention in times of crisis. They were the kind of people who build things with their hands and keep their savings in tin boxes, and go to church on Sunday, and never expect the world to pay them much attention. And when their neighborhood was destroyed, the world did not pay them much attention. The gas company paid settlements, the government conducted investigations, the neighborhood was rebuilt, and the story was quietly folded into local history, where it has remained ever since. The East Ohio gas explosion changed the natural gas industry forever. After 1944, above-ground LNG storage tanks were never again placed in residential neighborhoods. The industry shifted entirely to underground storage, and East Ohio Gas, which later became part of Dominion Energy, eventually built the largest underground gas storage facility in North America, far from any populated area. New federal safety standards were developed for LNG storage. New materials testing requirements were put in place. The disaster became a textbook case study in what happens when innovation outpaces safety, when the pressure to produce outweighs the obligation to protect. But none of that helps the 130 people who died on October 20th, 1944. None of that gives names to the 21 victims who were never identified. None of that returns the life savings that burned in tin boxes and coffee cans, in the bedroom closets of families who had trusted the wrong people. When they said that everything was perfectly safe, the danger was hiding right beneath their feet. That is the phrase that defines this story, and it works on more than one level. The liquefied natural gas that destroyed the St. Clair Norwood neighborhood did not fall from the sky. It did not come from an enemy nation. It traveled through the infrastructure that the neighborhood depended on every single day. The sewers, the storm drains, the underground pipes that carried water and waste and connected every home on every block to the systems that made modern life possible. The very infrastructure that was supposed to serve the community became the weapon that destroyed it. But the danger beneath their feet was not just physical. It was the danger of misplaced trust. The people of that neighborhood looked at those gas tanks every single day. They asked questions. They raised concerns. And they were told, by the people who were supposed to know, by the company that built the tanks and filled them and profited from them, that everything was safe, that the technology was proven, that there was nothing to worry about, and so they stopped worrying. They went about their lives. They raised their children and went to their jobs and kept their savings in tin boxes and said their prayers at St. Vitus Church and believed that the promises made to them by powerful people were worth something. They were not. Right now, in communities across the United States, there are families living next to industrial facilities, chemical storage sites, pipelines, refineries, and fuel depots. The people who live near those facilities ask questions. They raise concerns. They worry about what might happen. And the companies that operate those facilities say the same thing the East Ohio Gas Company said in 1944. Everything is perfectly safe. The technology is proven. There is nothing to worry about. Trust us. The people of St. Clair Norwood trusted them. And on a beautiful Friday afternoon in October, the trust killed 130 people and erased their neighborhood from the map. The question is not whether it could happen again. The question is whether we have learned anything at all. And that is the story of the East Ohio gas explosion of 1944. One of the deadliest and most forgotten industrial disasters in American history. A story of immigrants who built a neighborhood from nothing, a company that gambled with their lives, and a nation that looked the other way because there was a war on, and there were bigger headlines to chase. Here is what we want to know from you. Do you live near an industrial facility, a pipeline, a chemical plant, or a fuel storage site? Have you ever wondered whether the people who operate it are telling you the truth when they say it is safe? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if you thought this story was devastating, wait until you hear what we are covering next. Another forgotten disaster that most Americans have never heard of. Another community that was failed by the people who were supposed to protect them. And another story that history tried to bury. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. We tell the stories that history tried to forget. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and we will see you in the next one.